भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम् अद्वैतामृतवर्षिणीं भगवतीम् अष्टादशाध्यायिनीम् अम्ब त्वामनुसन्दधामि भगवद्गीते भवद्वेषिणीम् नमोऽस्तु ते व्यासविशालबुद्धे पुल्लारविन्दायतपत्रनेत्र येन त्वया भारततैलपूर्णः प्रज्वालितो ज्ञानमयप्रदीपः प्रपन्नपारिजाताय स्तोत्रवेत्रैकपाणये ज्ञानमुद्राय कृष्णाय गीतामृतदुहे नमः। सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दोग्धा गोपालनन्दनः पार्थो वत्सः सुधीर्भोक्ता दुग्धं गीतामृतं महत् वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णं वन्दे जगद्गुरुं तं ब्रह्मा वरुणेन्द्ररुद्रमरुतः स्तुन्वन्ति दिव्यैस्तवैः वेदैः साङ्गपदक्रमोपनिषदैः गायन्ति यं सामगाः ध्यानावस्थिततद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यं योगिनो यस्यान्तन्न विदुः सुरासुरगणाः देवाय तस्मै नमः।
Gurubhyo Namaha. We continue with chapter 3, Karma Yoga, and verses 5 to 7, the essence of Maharishi's translation and commentary. Nahi kaschit kshanam api jatu tishtati akarmakrut कार्यते हि अवसः कर्म सर्व प्रकृतिजै गुणैः कर्मेन्द्रियाणि संयम्य यः आस्ते मनसा स्मरन् इन्द्रियार्थान् विमूढात्मा मिथ्याचारः स उच्यते। यत्तु इन्द्रियाणि मनसा नियम्य आरभते अर्जुन कर्मेन्द्रिये हि कर्मयोगम् असक्तः स विशिष्यते. Here is the English translation. Bhagavan is saying, no one indeed can exist even for an instant without performing action, for everyone is helplessly driven to activity by the gunas born of nature. Again, no one indeed can exist even for an instant without performing action, for everyone is helplessly driven to activity by the gunas born of nature. He who sits restraining the organs of action and dwelling in his mind on the objects of sense, self-deluded, he is said to be a hypocrite. Again I repeat, he who sits restraining the organs of action and dwelling in his mind on the objects of sense, self-deluded, he is said to be a hypocrite. But he who, controlling the senses by the mind, without attachment, engages the organs of action in the yoga of action, he excels, O Arjuna. Again, but he who, controlling the senses by the mind, without attachment, engages the organs of action in the yoga of action, he excels, O Arjuna. Now let's review verse number 4 where we left off, where Bhagavan is saying, not by abstaining from action does a man achieve non-action, nor by mere renunciation does he attain to perfection. Here, the word non-action is Naishkarmya, and here Bhagavan explains that one enjoys freedom from the bondage of action even during activity when he is in Naishkarmya. Again, he explains renunciation as a state of non-attachment where the doer remains separate from the field of activity, and it is the state of non-action or Naishkarmya. And Bhagavan is clearly stating that in every case, the direct experience of being forms the basis of non-action. This is very important. In every case, the direct experience of being forms the basis of non-action. And one should not confuse non-action to abstaining from action, because by abstaining from action, one merely falls into a state of idleness or the inactivity of sleep. So now coming back to verse 5, Bhagavan is saying, no one indeed can exist even for an instant without performing action, because everyone is helplessly driven to activity by the gunas born of nature. Nature is the nearest English rendering of the word Prakriti, and the ultimate source of creation is transcendental, unmanifested, absolute being. Its nature consists of the three gunas, whose various permutations and combinations constitute all phenomenal existence. And their activity continues unceasingly in all fields of creation, and that is why Bhagavan says that everyone is helplessly driven to activity by the gunas. It is only in the transcendental field of existence that no activity is found. Again, it's only in the transcendental field of existence no activity is found. And this activity continues as both outward and inward physical activity, and it constitutes all of the relative life during the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Everything in creation evolves, and this process of evolution is always through activity. And this is why Bhagavan is saying, no one indeed can exist even for an instant without performing action. So again, Bhagavan is establishing activity as universal, and he is demonstrating the impossibility of gaining the state of non-action through non-engagement in activity in this verse. Again, it is impossible to gain the state of non-action through non-engagement in activity. Bhagavan further continues, he who sits restraining the organs of action and dwelling in his mind on the objects of sense, self-deluded, he is said to be a hypocrite. Here the word hypocrite means who is neither true to himself nor true to others. He hides his true nature. So, a hypocrite is neither true to himself nor true to others, and he hides his true nature. It is important to understand that even thinking belongs to the sphere of activity. And so, if we understand that action binds, then one becomes subject to its binding influence, even if one has entertained only a thought of action. Bhagavan further says, it is wrong to sit restraining the organs of action while the mind is dwelling on the objects of the senses. It further suggests that the technique of controlling the senses does not lie in direct restraint. It lies rather in the field of the mind, in the sphere of mental activity. So, the final teaching of this verse is, do not create strain by attempting directly to bridle the senses. Again, do not create strain by attempting directly to bridle the senses. Bhagavan further continues, but he who, controlling the senses by the mind, without attachment, engages the organs of action in the yoga of action, he excels, O Arjuna. Here the key words are controlling the senses by the mind, without attachment, engages the organs of action, and then yoga of action. There are 5 organs of action and 5 senses of perception. So the 5 organs of action are hands, feet, tongue, organs of reproduction and elimination. The 5 senses of perception are sight, hearing, smell, taste and touch. The yoga of action or karma yoga is performance of action with a skill that does not allow the senses of perception to register deep impressions of experiences. Here, the organs of action remain at work during activity. Then, the senses of perception also continue to experience. But the manner of their activity is such that while experiencing fully, they do not register deep impressions of experiences. So when a man is able to experience in this manner, then it is described as acting without attachment. So again, Karma Yoga is that state where the senses of perception are functioning in an organized and controlled manner, while the organs of action are active. How do the senses remain organized and controlled? And Bhagavan is saying that it is by virtue of a particular state of mind. This particular state of mind happens when the mind is established in the absolute bliss of divine consciousness through transcendental meditation. This is a simple technique by which the senses of perception are automatically controlled and organized. So, in order to become a karma yogi, nothing needs to be done other than infusing the mind with transcendental consciousness. Finally, when the senses of perception are active while the mind is in the state of pure consciousness, then this is called karma yoga. And here what is happening? The senses remain on their objects and the mind remains established in being. And this has already been explained in the verses 42 to 43 and 45 of chapter 2, the Sankhya Yoga, where one has to transcend the fields of mind and intellect and be without the three gunas. Here ends the essence of these verses 5 to 7, chapter 3, Karma Yoga, Maharishi's commentary of Bhagavad Gita. Now I will add a few words. The whole purpose of human life and the human birth is to gain more and more evolution to perfection, or we call it the enlightenment. So the whole purpose of this birth is to be self-realized, to know yourself. In reality, it has no other purpose. All the other things that come after the birth, the purpose, the goals, the ambitions, these are meant to take one towards this ultimate purpose of realizing oneself. So one has forgotten this true purpose and then gets confused and drawn into so many goals for the material life and sometimes the spiritual life too. And then one is caught up in achieving these many goals, desires, ambitions, and thinks that this is the sole purpose of whether having a career or making money or gaining something else. And the society further brings more conditioning in the mind that one has to have a purpose, one has to have certain goals, otherwise life is a waste. In essence, all these goals and all this purpose are only to gain something, live comfortably, and feel fulfilled. But the true purpose remains that one is born for self-realization and to be in bliss. Starting from childhood, one is given purpose. The family gives a sense of purpose and tells the child, you should become that or this, you should behave this way or that way. And one assumes that this whole life is to fulfill those purposes, whether it is career, marriage, accumulation of wealth and securities. These are needed goals, but they are not the ultimate purpose. It is a big sense of relief when one realizes that your only purpose is self-realization and happiness, or being in bliss. And all the purposes and goals are only to support this existence, this life, but they cannot lead one to fulfillment. This does not mean that one doesn't plan, one doesn't organize life. Yes, you have to do whatever is needed for livelihood and for existence, but one should not misunderstand that the purpose, this is the only purpose, and these are the true purposes in life. The more goals you set, the more things you think are purposeful, then more worries are created. And in general, people try to keep squeezing the maximum out of life, thinking this is how one should achieve all the goals and enjoy life. Here it is important to allow life to happen. Life is like a river. If you place your hands in the river and keep them open, the river will always be there in your hands. But if you try to hold it, you will have only empty hands. The moment you try to possess the river, then you will only have empty hands, and you will not be able to have life itself. It is again important to understand life has really no purpose. Life is life. And as long as one is caught up with all these material goals and spiritual goals, then you are moving further and further away from the true purpose. So for practical purposes, one has to really think, what is really the purpose of my life? Why am I doing what I am doing? What is the purpose of what I am doing? Where am I going with all this? And what is happening in my life? The purpose of gaining all the material comforts are to give you the ability to know yourself. And the purpose of all great spiritual practices is for you to become one with the being and be the being. Then you have attained this Purnatva, or the completion, or the wholeness. By nature, one has to work, and the senses have to be engaged in some action. And we understand that the mind becomes the master of the senses in cosmic consciousness. But until one gains this cosmic consciousness, one should consciously take the responsibility of these extrovert senses and bring integrity and responsibility to all actions. All transformation comes from within, and the most important thing is always raising the consciousness. By continuously helping others, thinking of others, and enriching others will bring more and more transformation within oneself, and one gains more and more nature's support. Normally, there is a practical way to organize one's work to give the best results. Working on a time scale, finishing the list of tasks that are planned, creating a certain structure. These are important and these should be followed. But to everything that you are doing, these 4 tattvas, the 4 principles, have to be applied. Working with authenticity, that means to your peak performance, being responsible, being integrated, and then thinking always of being helpful and enriching others and everyone and everything around you. Now let us take a minute and see what is the root of all these actions. The root of all actions originates in a person's vasanas. And what are these vasanas? These are the inherent tendencies, which are also known as aptitude or urges. And these vasanas define his individual nature. And these vasanas result from one's own past actions. The past actions produce present vasanas, and then the present vasanas are producing further actions. So vasana becomes the cause and action is effect. Again, action becomes the cause and vasana the effect. So we understand that these vasanas are the prime mover in the mechanism of action. The vasanas themselves remain unmanifest, and the actions are the ultimate manifestation of these vasanas. Now, if we look at the action in detail, we would see what comes first is the vasana. Then this is followed by thought, desire, and then action. So as long as the vasanas exist in an individual, the thoughts, desires, and actions will constantly flow out of him. And when these vasanas have been exhausted, then the thoughts, desires, and actions will cease. And this state of non-action is then referred to as total exhaustion of vasanas. Now we have understood that these impressions become less and less or non-existent in the state of cosmic consciousness. So then it is important to understand, especially for the seeker, the enlightened state is referred to as Naishkarmya, which is non-action. And this non-action is different from inaction. And one does not gain enlightenment through inaction. So one should not get into the folly of resignation from activity. Then the idleness will creep in, and this is what has created so much of damage in the society, especially the Hindu society. And when one is not working, and when there is abstinence from this work, which is only on the outward, but still having these vasanas which are unmanifest within, and creating unnecessary restraint and restrictions, and denying the physical pressures while the desires are still lingering on, we have understood that such practices only lead to suppression and not God realization. Again, it is important to remind yourself that no one can remain without performing action even for a moment. As long as there are vasanas within, they drive an individual to activity. And the type of activities will depend upon the qualities of the gunas. And based on the gunas, then the vasanas can also be threefold. Different vasanas propel people to different realms of activity. For example, There can be vasanas for music, for sports, for achieving something else. And these vasanas will vary depending on the gunas, which are the tamas, the rajas and the sattva. In a tamasic person, then these vasanas also express more ignorance and inertia, indolence and indifference, and indisposed to activity. Such a person will prefer a dull and inactive life and does not have the intellectual convictions to carry out any work. And the vasanas that are expressed in a rajasic person drives him into the worldly experiences. He continuously wants to acquire and enjoy all the worldly objects. The mind remains restless, always with vacillating moods and emotions. And one has unending, relentless desires. And these desires prompt many activities. Now these same vasanas will manifest in a sattvic person in a different way. His activities will be drawn to more contemplation, meditation, and naturally he will be speaking truth, and naturally he remains detached from much of the worldly actions and excitements, and naturally drawn to knowledge and nature. So the most important thing to understand here, whatever is their nature and quality based on these gunas, one's vasanas will drive one helplessly to act in accordance with them. And because of these vasanas, human beings are drawn to action helplessly according to the inherent nature of the gunas. As long as these vasanas exist, they forcefully express themselves as thoughts and desires, and the individual becomes powerless to contain them and to control them. And every person possesses these desires until he reaches the state of self-realization. If one restrains himself physically but continues to mentally indulge in the sense objects, then one will suffer from repression and suppression. So the only way to deal with these vasanas is to be aware of them, but to continuously transcend, because these desires, these vasanas, these impressions, none of these are there in the transcendental consciousness. And when the transcendental consciousness becomes established throughout the waking, dreaming and sleeping states, and it becomes existence, then all these impressions and the vasanas and these patterns will be just like drawing a line in the water. They will be so faint. Here it is very important to understand that you cannot control these vasanas or the desires. You cannot eliminate these vasanas just like that. And these vasanas and the samskaras and these impressions, these are the ones which continue and give rise to birth after birth. So one has to transcend, one has to rise in the consciousness and be established in cosmic consciousness, so that one can completely eliminate all these vasanas and the impressions caused by them. Until that happens, then one lives life in a dharmic way, fulfilling all the goals and the purpose of life in a dharmic way, maintaining the integrity, being integrated, living up to the full potential and the peak possibilities, and being responsible for yourself and for others, and continuously sharing, giving, caring and enriching everyone and everything around you. These are the Vedic principles. So I will stop here and we will continue tomorrow. Jai Gurudev, Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu.